koutou, kutumia tuatei, tēnei te mihi ki te mana whenua o te rohi nei, tēnā koutou, kia koe toa, kia ora mo tō tautoko, kia mātua tēnei wā. Ko ngāpui toku iwi, no mōtatau hau, ko mōtatau te marae, ko Anaru Waa tōku ingoa. So as Philippa just said, I'm at the Iri Pomare Centre, and sorry, I've already pushed the wrong button, and I've been involved with the Resilient Urban Futures project. I'm going to briefly start off by talking about this idea of who are urban Māori anyway, and there's lots of different ways of defining this concept. I'll talk a bit about a small piece of research that we did in terms of looking at definitions and looking at what we do and don't know about the population demographics of urban Māori. So as we know, post-World War II, the Māori population rapidly urbanised. Before World War II, or in the early part of the 20th century, 85% of our population was in predominantly rural areas. Now it's predominantly urban areas, plus 85+%. It's a diverse population. We have the mana whenua, who are the foundation for Māori population in urban settings. We also have a very large group of non-mana whenua Māori who have migrated to these settings. On top of that, we've got this evolving urban culture and cultures, things like music cultures, all our kapahaka groups, sports groups. So we're a really diverse bunch, and we were quite interested in this. We also found that there wasn't a lot of information about exploring this diversity, especially with all the rich stuff we can get out of the census statistics. So I'm going to talk briefly about a paper that was led by John Rikes, who was also in this Tāone Tupu Ora project, looking at mapping urban Māori populations. So one of the first things we thought about is trying to come up with some definitions around what we mean by urban Māori. A lot of these definitions are interchangeable. And so we looked at some of the common terminology, we borrowed from that, we adapted it, and we came up with some of our own terms as well. Here, when we talk about urban Māori, we're talking about any Māori living in the urban setting. So it can be mana whenua, it can be people who've migrated there as well. This is the whole caboodle, and also in peri-urban areas. So in the Wellington area, for example, we included the Kapiti Coast, even though it's not part of the council, just because it seems to be part of the fabric of the urban environment that we're in. Of course, mana whenua are a very important part of the puzzle. They're the traditional inhabitants of the land. They have mana over the land. They have specific treaty rights. So whenever we talk about urban Māori in any of our cities, we've got to recognise mana whenua. The other group, which we refer to as mātāwaka, and it comes from the way it's used in the Independent Māori Statutory Board in Auckland, are the non-traditional inhabitants, i.e. those that have migrated to certain settings. So we use that as quite a broad term. And within that, we identify this group called tauira here, and literally means the bound rope, or those people who live in urban settings but still connect physically, tangibly, going back home, or abstractly back to their own iwi and hapu of origin. Interestingly, there's actually two other groups. One group, which we haven't really covered here, are those that identify Māori descent in the census but don't identify as Māori, and then there's another bunch who identify as Māori but don't identify their iwi in the census statistics. And there could be lots of reasons for this. They might choose not to in the census, they might miss the question, but there's also a bunch that we know that aren't either familiar with their iwi or their hapu, or who choose not to be, or choose not to define it in the census. And this group we call taonga hau. This is a new term, because this group was undefined. Taonga hau means the new anchorage. It's a metaphor, and literally means, like I said, new anchorage is a metaphor for those who come to urban environments, drop the anchor in the harbour of the mana whenua under the auspices, but choose to make this place their home. So these are the definitions that we use for our project. We looked in 4 urban areas, Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington and Christchurch, and this is just some basic overview statistics. So here you'll see that the mana whenua population varies a lot in terms of the proportion of the total Māori population. It's not a numbers game, but we're just interested in seeing how the proportions vary. Hamilton and Christchurch, it's a much larger population, which makes sense because the urban centres are like focal points for much larger iwi confederations, i.e. Ngai Tahu and Tainui. The Tauira Here population is proportionally large in a lot of these areas, particularly Wellington and Auckland. Interestingly, the taonga hau population stays relatively stable. One thing we're thinking about here is actually maybe the taonga hau population is made up of both mana whenua, those descent from mana whenua, as well as tauira here. So in terms of our model that I showed you before, maybe this taonga hau group sits in the middle somewhere. And just quickly, I'll just look at the Wellington diagram. Here's some GIS mapping that we did, and basically looked at the distribution. If you look at the two coloured diagrams up on the left, those are the distributions of mana whenua and taurahiri. You'll see that, obviously, because in Wellington the mana whenua is a relatively small population, so the colours are quite light, but where it gets a bit darker, there's a few concentrations. We think this is indicative of being focused around marae and things like papakainga and things like that. Really underlines the importance of these sorts of places for having a critical mass for mana whenua, and I'm sure other people might have some ideas around that. In comparison, the taurahiri population tends to be a bit more evenly distributed, but there are focal points, and you'll see around the harbour there's one, I'll put the little arrows on, where there's a focal point, and that seems to me to be around where the Kōkiri marae area is, so there's an urban marae there. Wakefield. Oh, I might have had my map all wrong there. All right, here you go. So just some concluding thoughts. It's just a brief overview. It's just one way of looking at diversity. There's lots of different other ways you can cut it. But we think that when we talk about local governance and participation in local governance, it's really important to understand what sort of demographics and who's participating and how we can understand what's going forward. For example, the Taonga Hou group, which is more theoretical than actual at the moment in terms of the way we're looking at it, what happens to that group over time? Will they connect? Do we encourage them to connect back to the iwi? Some might consolidate into their own entities entirely, and that's what you might be seeing with some of the urban marae and urban authorities. Perhaps more concerningly, some of these groups might eventually, over time, cease to identify as Māori, and we might lose them. So we've got things that we're facing, and I think as our urban cities in New Zealand, Aotearoa go ahead, we need to think about what's going to happen with these groups. And also, in particular, how they get represented in urban governance. So that's me, just a quick overview, and I'll hand over to the next speaker.